stand up now. Take a close look. Living in L'Arche looks like for 48 years? 45. 45 years. 45 years. 49 years. And John Loss, 49 years? Wow. You guys are looking pretty good. So thank you for being here. Joe and Mary have lots of stories with you, Dave and John, about the founding of L'Arche, and so we're really, really grateful, Joe, that you're here to inspire us and get our day started. For those of you who don't know Joe has a long history of roles in not only our community as community leader for many, many years, but also internationally, nationally. I think you did it all, Joe, right?
More or less.
More or less. Joe officially is retired, but not really. He's still supporting the mission in his own ways. And one thing I know true to be about Joe is that he lives the mission of L'Arche, and he is someone who has inspired so many of us to remain faithful to the mission, and that fidelity is really present, Joe, in your relationship with Dave. And so thank you for being here. Thank you, Mary, for being here. And we are excited to listen to you this morning.
Could you bring that mic over, please? No. Can everybody hear? Okay. A little bit louder. Might be easier to turn the system up than me. Is that okay? Okay. Well, as usual, David and I have practiced this presentation for at least 3 weeks now. And so we'll see how it goes. I wrote a few things down, but I'm also depending on your memory, David, which is quite good typically. And when Mary and I often have lunch with David down at Joe's Hamburgers, David is always asking, whatever happened to old so-and-so? And he'd pull a name out of his memory, and a name that Mary and I had totally forgotten about 40 years ago. And we'd talk about so-and-so and what happened and so on. So we're really counting on you, David, to fill in some of the blanks. And I might test your memory a little bit too, if that's okay.
That's okay.
Okay, that's good. Want to thank you for the beginning. I've had my exercise for the week already this morning, so that's great. And Mary and I, after our little presentation, we'll be going over to the Mary Ann home to visit with Mary's mother, who's 95. And she's on the same floor that Janice and Arliss live on. And the energy level over there isn't quite up to the Daybreak standard yet. So appreciate that start. So our task this morning is to share a little bit about the gift of this land. And of course, if you go back many, many years, this land and all of Canada belonged to Indigenous people. And so we're not going to go that far back, but it's always a good reminder for all Canadians to recognize the original gift of this land that we call Canada to our founding people. But I'd like to go back and start in 1968. And that's when Jean Vanier gave a retreat. Do you remember where that was, David? At Mary Lake. I knew you'd come through. And this was the very first retreat that Jean Vanier gave. And Mary Lake is up in King City. It's an Augustinian monastery. And on that retreat were a number of people who were very involved in L'Arche eventually. People like Sue Mosteller and Sister Marie Parody. And on that retreat, there was also a Sister Rosemary Donovan. And she was the Superior General of Our Ladies Missionaries. And at the end of that retreat, Jean simply announced, we hope to get L'Arche started in the Toronto area. And Steve and Ann Newroth had come back from Trolley and were ready to start. And Jean simply said, if anyone here could help us with that, I'd love to chat with you. And Sister Rosemary came up at the end of the retreat and said, well, we have this old novitiate and 7 acres of land in Richmond Hill. Would that be of any help to you? And Jean, being a smart man, probably said yes. And that's how things started. And I'd just like to say a little bit about Our Ladies Missionaries. This was a small religious group of sisters who were missionaries. And so there's kind of a link between them and eventually what became the Mission of L'Arche around the world. So these sisters, there were maybe 30 or 40 of them, and they didn't have a lot of property, they didn't have a lot of money, and this property was their novitiate from about 1962 to 1968. And at its peak, they had about 20 to 25 sisters in formation here, all living in the big house. And then they moved back to Toronto. And I learned a few things many, many years later about this decision of theirs to give the property to Daybreak. One was that Sister Rosemary said at the time, they took a vote of all the confirmed members of their community whether to give this gift to Daybreak or not. And so it wasn't just her decision alone, but it was the whole congregation at the time, and every single one of them agreed to give this property to us. And then she smiled and told me, and that was against the advice of the local bishop. Which didn't surprise me either, but they stuck to their guns. And one other condition that I learned many, many years later in the legal agreement, which transferred the property to us, was a clause that said if Daybreak closed up, failed for any reason, or if we wanted to sell any part of the property that they were giving to us, they had the option to buy back everything for $1. And it's probably good that most of us didn't know that as we were living those first 21 years. So the sisters were not naive, but at the same time, they did want us to succeed. And so there was this encouragement to really take root here and make Daybreak a success. And so they gave the big house and 7 acres of land to Daybreak. And there were a few other buildings on the property. And David, when you came 49 years ago, there was not much, but there were a few things on the property. Can you remember what was here that came along with the big house?
The barn in the big house.
Basically, it was the barn in the big house. There was a machine shed. It's now the craft studio where they parked the tractors. There was an orchard. And that was about it. And Daybreak bought another 13 acres from the Basilian Fathers. So we ended up with the 20 acres. And and Daybreak started. And there was a very old chicken coop. Do you remember the chicken coop, David? Which we had to tear down eventually. But at one time, there were 400 chickens in that chicken coop that provided work. And I always have this vision, for those of you who knew George Beatty, who was probably the biggest person who's ever lived at Daybreak. He was as tall as Steve and probably 100 pounds heavier. And George was in charge of the eggs. You had to grade the eggs, you know. And Big George, who had hands twice the size of mine, would have this little tiny egg in his hand trying to figure out which pile to put it in. And Len Lomas told the story one time when he asked George, or whoever it was, could you bring me 3 dozen eggs, cracked eggs, because we always kept the cracked eggs for our own use. We couldn't sell them. And Len waited and waited and waited, and no eggs, and finally George, whoever it was, showed up, and Len said, what the hell took you so long? And he said, well, we didn't have any cracked ones, so I had to crack 3 dozen for you. The other little warning is, you might not know this, but the Trans-Canada gas pipeline runs under our property. And so if you're a smoker, please be careful. But for a number of us sitting here today, it might be hard to imagine what this property looked like 50 years ago. And it really was a semi-rural area, all the way from Elgin Mills north and from Yonge to over to Bay. There wasn't much. And so if you came up Yonge Street, like I did on the GO bus when I first arrived at Daybreak, you know, you would notice the Orange Home for sure. Pick Seed had their company down the road, and we became friends with them, and you'll learn about their gift later. And then there was the big house, and a lot of open space. And so Daybreak's really first identity really was as a farm community. And there was just a lot of open space. And of course, when you look around today, it looks quite normal for a subdivision and so on, but we had a lot of space. And one of the things that David and I did, and David and many, many other assistants over the years, was to go for a long stroll into the back fields all the way to the railroad tracks. And Dave, you would have what with you when we would go for those walks? Your pipe. And if you wanted to find us, you could just follow the tobacco on the ground, kind of all the way back. But it was a great way to get to know you, David, and you to get to know me, and talk about the 1 or 2 problems we had in living community back in those days. But I would say I was formed by you, David, during those walks. And just to listen to what your concerns were and how you thought and felt about what was going on in the community, and a way of processing that for both of us, eh? Mm-hmm. And how many times do you think you made that trip back to the railroad tracks?
100 times.
Yeah, probably 100 times a year. So in those days, you know, some people went to the local workshop, but basically the men worked on the farm and the women looked after the houses. Now that, you know, things have changed 50 years later, thank God, but that's basically the way it worked in those days. And so there were the chickens, and there were animals we had during those days. And of course, a big change happened when Steve had the foresight to actually hire a farmer to run the farm. And so when Len Lomas was hired, in the mid-70s, it made a big change, and we got quite more serious about what was happening. We had huge gardens. We had an egg route in Richmond Hill, so when once a week we would drive around and deliver eggs to people in Richmond Hill, and later on when we had the bakery, we would sell bread. And one of my jobs one year was to do the egg route, and so I did it with Helen Humphreys. And Helen was a delightful, crazy lady who lived at the big house and later on Church Street. And she would sell the bread and I would bring the eggs. And she would be totally delighted when someone didn't want the eggs, but they would buy her bread. And she would just howl with laughter, like, "You're such a poor salesman, Joe. You can't even sell eggs, and people want my bread." And we did that for about 3 hours every Wednesday morning, and then she totally ignored me the rest of the week. But it was a good way to get to know people in Richmond Hill. One of the other things that happened was we developed the pond, which is just out the window there. And can you say a little bit what happened around the pond, Dave, during the old days? Were you here when they dug up the pond? It's true that we used to swim in the pond in the summer. We had our annual family picnic on the pond every year. We skated on the pond, and well, some people skated. I'm not a big skater. Some people skated on the pond. And I found this picture. You won't be able to see it very well. But it was in a 1972 issue of the Letters of L'Arche. And it's the picture of the Daybreak hockey team on the pond. And David, you're in it, and John Bloss and Frank Sutton, and George was the goalkeeper, which I thought was brilliant because he was bigger than any net, I'm sure. And one of the funny things about the pond was, particularly as the winter approached, and the snow coming down reminded me of this, is every single year, one bright assistant would always go and get the tractor and test the thickness of the ice. And every single year, what happened, Dave?
They used to put it through the pond.
It was like it was a Daybreak tradition. This is the day that someone's going to, it wasn't the same person every year, obviously, put the tractor through the ice. But we had two tractors, so the second tractor could always pull out the first tractor. Then one really brilliant young assistant, when I was community leader, decided to use one of the Daybreak vehicles to test the thickness of the ice. And he is lucky that the ice was thick enough that year, and the car didn't end up in the bottom of the pond. Do you remember that, Dave?
I think it was you.
No. That's not my memory. Then there was, everything didn't go smoothly on the land in those days. And I remember one summer day, I was having a very quiet, peaceful day in the office there at the big house. And I'm sure, Trish, you'll have a quiet, peaceful day some year. And the phone rang, and I answered it and said, "Good morning, it's Daybreak. How can I help you?" And the fellow said, "Your cows are loose on Young Street." And I said, "Well, I'll transfer you to the cow department to look after that." And the first two cows, we had three cows in the very beginning. One was called, do you remember the name of the milking cow we had got from Mary Lake? Alice, that's a good name, but actually her name was May. And so we had a milking cow, and as assistants we had to take turns learning how to milk May every day and then go to the workshop and pasteurize the milk for the houses. And some of us were better at that than others. And then we had two beef cattle that Len bought. Do you remember the names of the beef cattle?
No.
No. Well, I don't know why I remember, but they were named Wes and Gus. Maybe after Gus Leuschner, I don't know who Wes was. And so when you used to go walk in the back fields, you'd go say hi to Wes and Gus. And people got very attached to Wes and Gus until, unfortunately, the day Wes and Gus left the farm and came back a week later as steak and roast beef and hamburger. And after that, we stopped naming the cattle. Good grief. The other thing in terms of the history that's important to talk about is the redevelopment of this property. And that began in the early 1980s when I got a letter from the town of Richmond Hill announcing the fact that they had decided to rezone this whole area from Elgin Mills up to the 19th Avenue and from Yonge to Bayview, to change it from agricultural to residential. And at first we didn't realize what this might mean for us, but it became clear fairly quickly, because with that decision, the Basilian Fathers decided to sell the 150 acres around us that they had generously rented to us for $1 a year for all those beginning years so that we could farm that property. And so they sold their property to a developer called Gray 5, and this began a whole series of meetings with the town, with lawyers, with planners, and it was hard for us to imagine what exists today back in those early years in terms of what would be the impact on us as we tried to live community here. And in fact, it raised the question of, should we just sell all the property and move further north, move to another rural area? And in the end, we decided, no, that didn't seem to be the right thing to do. But we had lots of skirmishes. The town decided to put a high school on our property. That was in their official plan. And another part of their official plan was to put York land right through the middle of the new house. And that was a bit of a surprise when we saw that plan, because people were living in the new house, obviously, at the time, still are. And so it took a lot of meetings and negotiations to develop what we have today. And but with that decision to redevelop this whole area and the beginning of the houses around us, it obviously meant that we couldn't continue as a farm community in the same way. And so it was really quite sad the day we had to auction off all our farm equipment. And Len had worked the property with a lot of help from people like John Smeltzer and others. And it was really, really a painful, sad day, but the transition was very difficult. And I'll never forget the day when the bulldozers came. And in 2 days, they leveled every single tree that was in the property around us. And it was so shocking. And this is what you have to do when you put in a subdivision. You have to put in the sewers and the electricity, the roads. But the land that we loved was radically changed overnight. I mean, we knew it was coming. And that day I got a phone call from the developer because one of the assistants in the greenhouse had hung on a sheet on the side of the greenhouse a big sign saying, "You murderers." Which I apologize for. I couldn't blame the team at the greenhouse, but I understood how they felt, but it didn't really help our relationship with the developer. Because we had to get along with these folks. And but we lived in a dust bowl for weeks and weeks and weeks as things developed around us. Do you remember those days, David, how you felt?
Mm-hmm. Brad and Colby and I just cried.
Yeah, it was really tough. It was really tough. And, many years later, when we bought 2 houses in the subdivision, we had a little different feeling about it. And as we worked out and Deversley Road was put in and we could safely get out of this property without running up onto Young Street and risking our lives, like we did for many, many years. And today, we live on a beautiful oasis. And we have a lot to be thankful for as things developed around us. And a big gratitude to Carl McMillan, Alan Dobbs, and so on, who really took it upon themselves and many others to plant trees and develop the walk around the pond and so on. And this property has been home for 50 years. For David, for John, but for so many of us who have come, hundreds of people over the 50 years, and their lives have been changed. And so when we celebrate today and celebrate this whole year, this gift of our 50 years, it's so important to remember that little seed that was planted at that retreat. And the willingness of those nuns to give their property to an unknown, unproven community, and to trust the providential urging of the Spirit for them to offer that to us. This extraordinary gift. And we can never be grateful enough. And it wasn't just those of us who lived on this property, but from this property, many other L'Arche communities began, where we sent assistance to start L'Arche Vancouver, to start L'Arche Hamilton. That assistants who lived here, like myself and Sue Mosteller and Steve Newroth and others, because of what we lived here, were called to assume roles to help L'Arche grow in other parts of Canada and around the world. And so there's something extraordinary in this gift. And so one of the questions for today and for this year is, what are we willing to risk to honor that gift, treasure that gift, and allow something new to be born in these next 50 years? Always remembering the gift of Our Ladies Missionaries.
And what can we do?
And what else would you like to say, David?
Just pray.
Let's pray. And as we pray this year, to remember Our Ladies Missionaries. The end. And that just went exactly how we practice it, David. Thank you. One thing I forgot to mention is, David, you had a little workshop on this property. It was right over here on the pond, eh?
Yeah.
Where you created masterpiece after masterpiece, eh?
Yeah.
And where's your workshop today?
What the noise?
Big house.
Yeah, it was here at the big house, and now you have it, it was down at the greenhouse now, eh? Anyway, we've gone over time, so we're going to end. Thank you.
Thank you, dancers. If I could ask you just to have a seat, please. Could I ask you to have a seat? Have a seat, and I just want to take a moment to just give thanks for the sisters, Our Ladies Missionaries, and that wonderful, pivotal, important, life-changing decision that they made to gift us this property. Here, and here they are now. Okay, silence please, the sisters are here. There's Sister Mary Trish and Sister Mary Kathy Kelly. And we're joining them, and it is 1969. And these sisters have been praying for some time about a very important decision that they have to make. So let's join them and let's listen in on their conversation. Sister Mary Trish, Sister Mary Kathy Kelly, good morning.
Boy, Sister Mary Kathy. Oh, you know, sisters are out all doing such great work, and here we are in this big, empty place. I don't know.
It's so lonely at night.
Yes.
Nobody around.
Yes.
Why are we here in such a big, big space?
It is very big, Sister Mary Tom. Sister Mary Ann. You know, boy, that retreat we were at, though, at Mary Lake with Jean Vanier. Now, that got me kind of thinking, Sister Mary Kathy. What about you?
Oh, that moved my heart, that Jean Vanier. Yes, he did. And I like what he was talking about.
And you know, he hoping to start L'Arche in Canada, and we have this big house and all this land. You know, maybe we need to consult with some of the other sisters and see what they think. I wonder if we could call in Sister Mary Lorenzo and Sister Mary Sister Mary, Kathy, and I, and okay, that retreat was so amazing with Jean Magnier. Our big house is so empty. We were thinking maybe we should give our land and our home to L'Arche. What do you think?
I think we're very comfortable here.
Oh.
But it's so big. We don't need all this space.
I didn't say. No.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I don't know. Okay. We should consult some of the other sisters. Sister Mary Jim. Sister Mary Jim. Oh, Sister Mary Jim, I hope you've been praying. Yeah, okay, so Sister Mary, Kathy, and I, we have this really amazing idea. We've been praying about it. That retreat we were on, were you there?
Oh, yes.
We're thinking of giving this big house and the land to Jean Magnier to start L'Arche in Canada. What do you think?
Oh, I think absolutely not. I think we should sell the land or develop the land, build condos. We could make a lot of money.
Sister Mary, Kathy, what are condos? Sister Mary Jim, maybe you should go back to prayer, and maybe we'll.
We need to pray a lot.
Okay, now Sister Mary Agnieszka and Sister Mary Kim. Now they've been praying all morning. So let's bring them out of prayer and see what the Lord has been saying to them all morning. Sister Mary Kim, Sister Mary Agnieszka. Please. Welcome to our circle.
Oh, yes. Welcome. Good to be in a circle.
Okay, now you two have been praying all morning. We need the Lord's guidance here, and we know you've been praying. We want to give our home and our land to L'Arche. Now, we're not all in agreement here, so Sister Mary Agnieszka, what has the Lord been telling you all morning?
Well, the Lord told me to flip the coin. Or
I don't know if that's a great idea. This is way too big of a decision. Sister Mary Kim, what has the Lord been telling you?
The Lord says to me we should give this land to L'Arche in the home Lost Daybreak show.
are here. Now, I know we're not all in agreement, but let's agree to meet back here in 50 years, and we'll see what the Lord has done for us, okay? We'll meet back here in 50 years? Yes. All right.
From a lady missionary to the